Welcome to this workshop. In this workshop, we will use MuleSoft to upsert contacts information into Salesforce. As an input, we will set up an HTTP listener to listen for an HTTP post message, which carries the contact information and payload in JSON format. We will then use the MuleSoft connector for Salesforce to convert that JSON payload into the Salesforce data format and conduct the upsert operation. And after the upsert operation is completed, we will get the upserted record ID from Salesforce as an output, and we will display that and send that back as a response payload into the HTTP connector, which will be available to the HTTP to the client application, which is making the HTTP post for the upsert. So let us see this in action. Once again, I am logged into my MuleSoft Anypoint Studio, which is running on my desktop. I will go ahead and create a new Mules project, name that as SFDC upsert, choose the runtime, click next couple of times, and this creates the Mule flow, which I will use to create this upsert operation. As you saw from the previous example of the query, it creates a similar project, and I need to set it up, and I will start with the HTTP listener component. Drag the listener component, and I will configure it. In this case, I will change the port from 8081 to 8082 because in my previous example of the query, I used 8081. So if I'm running both of them at the same time, there is no port conflict that I have to deal with. You could alternately use the same port and run each of the projects at a time. Contacts as the path. I will also use a logger component just to log the payload that's coming in as part of the HTTP post. In this case, I'm just outputting the payload that's coming in. And for that, I'm using this particular expression, which is called Mule expression language. Next, I'm going to configure the Salesforce connector by dragging it into my palette and configuring the authentication. In this case, I will choose basic authentication. And just like the last time, I need to provide it with the username, password, and security token. So I'm going to use the similar mechanism that I used last time, dc.username. I'm going to use parameters to populate that. Password. And lastly, the token. Since I've provided the actual values, I'm going to go ahead and choose the operation. In this case, I'm going to choose upsert, which is going to ask me for two important options. Let's validate this with the actual value that we input. So successful connection. And we create the S object that we want to upsert, in this case, contact. And we provide the external ID field name. External ID is an ID that Salesforce usually uses to identify a unique record when using the external APIs to upsert the objects. So in this case, we know that the email field is a unique entity, and we will use that to as an upsert key or an external ID key to be able to identify unique records. We completed configuring the Salesforce connector. Now we need to transform the incoming message, which is coming in JSON format, into the Salesforce specific format. For that, we use a transformer or a transform message component provided in Mule, which provides a powerful component called data weave. And this data weave is used for transforming one message format to another. As you can see, since I've configured the Salesforce connector, it automatically recognizes the contact object and its structure and populates that for me as an output. All I need to do is look at my payload and map that to this output object. As an example of payload, I'm going to use this particular payload: first name, last name, email, and home phone. I'm going to update this to reflect the right name on the email. And so we have four components: last name, first name, email, and home phone. Now we're going to map that to our components that are there in the contact object of Salesforce. And we're going to take this from the payload. Second component that we are going to map is the first name. Again, we're going to take it from the payload. Third component, which is our key, is going to be the email. It's right here. I'm again going to take it from the payload. The last is the home phone. I'm going to take that again from the payload. Save this. And now I also want to ensure that I'm sending as a response the object ID that was upserted. So for that, I will drag in another component to transform the output. And in this case, I want a JSON output, so I'm going to change the output type to JSON. And I'm going to define my own output variables. In this case, I'm going to say whether it was a successful or unsuccessful. Again, take it from the payload because the payload has changed now with this variable. And as you can see, it automatically populates the payload this time because it knows that it's going to get this kind of output from the Salesforce connector. I'm also going to populate the ID, name it as SFDC ID payload.t. And in case there are any errors, we're going to populate the error errors. So this is going to be my output. Let's save this and let's run this using the embedded Mule server. So it has been deployed successfully, and now we will now test it with this Postman HTTP client. And over here, I have the payload, I have the method as post. We will type in the URL and also make sure the content type is set accurately. Click on send. Okay, so now it gives an error. So let's look at what the error is. As you can see from the console, it displays the error that is actually encountered in the connector. So it looks like the error is coming from the transformer phase, in which it is unable to match the JSON into and convert it into a hash map, which it internally uses to convert it into a Salesforce object. So let's relook at this. Many of such object hierarchies are actually declared as arrays. So we will declare this as an array so that the idea is it can hold multiple such elements within the array and not just a single element. We will save this. Hopefully this should compile again. And we will try to run this again. In this case, you can see that the output that has come from Salesforce is also a collection of arrays, and it was successful. The record was successfully upserted into Salesforce, and the current ID that the Salesforce instance has assigned for this particular record is this one. Now let's log into the Salesforce instance. Over here, I'm logged into the Salesforce instance. We'll go into contacts and make sure Andy Jones is inserted. And we see that Andy Jones has been created with this particular email ID and this particular home phone number. Now we will, since this is an upsert operation, it either inserts or updates. So now we will update Andy's phone number from 8900 ending to 5600 ending and send the same request back. As you can see, this particular transaction was also successful, and we will refresh Andy's record here in Salesforce and see that the home phone got upserted. So now we actually saw an API that we created and an endpoint that can actually update or insert new contacts into Salesforce with an HTTP post operation. Thank you for watching this workshop.